From early in his writing career, Eric Blair adopted the nom de plume under which he's now universally known. He became George Orwell. In his will, he emphatically directed that no biography of him should be written, and to ensure that his wishes were respected, effectively covered up his traces. Blair hid behind Orwell. Despite Orwell's reticence about himself, it's not difficult to imagine him as a small boy, with the great fondness for fishing which finds so frequent expression in his writings. The small boy of those days would scarcely have envisaged going to Eton, as Orwell did, even with a scholarship. And beyond that, socialism, the Spanish Civil War, the ups and downs of a penurious writer's life, and finally, and belatedly, fame and success. When I visited Orwell in hospital a day or so before he died, there was a fishing rod at the end of his bed, in preparation, as he hoped, for expeditions when he was better. Towards the end of his life, he increasingly reverted to his origins. The little boy lived again in the middle-aged writer, as did the countryside he'd roamed over, the streams he'd fished. If the significance of Orwell's life could be succinctly expressed, it was a protest on behalf of the individual against the collectivist pressures of his time. This attitude of mind began at school.
So what was this little boy, Eric Blair, like? What impression did he make on you when you first saw him here?
Well, this is how I described him, writing about it a few years afterwards. Tall, pale, with his flaccid cheeks, large spatulate fingers and supercilious voice, he was one of those boys who seem born old. We often walked together over the downs in our green jerseys and corduroy breeches discussing literature, and we both won in consecutive years the inevitable Harrow History Prize. I was a stage rebel, Orwell a true one. But I think that that's literature, you know, and I'm really describing him as he was a few years later. I think as a little boy, well, it's so very hard to remember when one was a little boy what other little boys were like, but he was merrier than that. He can't have been all that tall when he was 12, say. And I do remember his spatulate fingers. They were very extraordinary. His hands were quite different to most boys' hands. And I believe spatulate fingers are very uncommon anyhow.
Was he liked, or was he reasonably popular?
Well, yes, you know, there was always something about him that people couldn't help liking him. However much he shocked them and disapproved of them and antagonized them, in nearly all cases, something shone through about him which made you want him to like you a little bit better. And you never lost your temper with him, although he was absolutely maddening. And maddening in his affectation of superiority and general belittling of everything.
Was it an abnormally snobbish school, do you think?
Well, I think England was an abnormally snobbish country. I think the school simply reflected the pre-1914 feeling that if you weren't what was called in society, you were no one. If you weren't connected with large houses and the establishment kind of jobs, you were no one, and it was your business to get yourself made into someone as fast as possible.
I suppose
it was no worse than other schools, I'm sure of that.
I suppose from the point of view of any kind of homosexual elements, he was by no means what's called a pretty boy from that point of view.
No, and I think he was almost without a trace of homosexual feelings, too. He had a natural interest in sex and in what happened, how babies were born, and the whole school, we were always made to feel there was this fearful, nameless vice that went on, and which he refers to at great length, and whether or not you were masturbated, for instance, well, nobody knew what it meant, but we were spoken to as if we all knew, and we're all having a very hard time avoiding it.
Yes,
of course, there were always a few people who did know, usually South Americans and Indians and precocious members of other nations.
So I don't think either you or Orwell was particularly great at cricket, were you?
No, we were the stuff of second 11s at preparatory schools. But we did spend a terrible lot of time in nets like these, and I remember the very, very alarming feelings of being hemmed in while one batted and various bowlers bowled at one, including the school fast bowler, and the masters looked on to see if one was promising material, and one knew one would be found out if one was flinching. Whereas at bowling, it was all right because you could bowl away without getting hurt.
Were you zealous for games, you two, or not, or did you treat them rather contemptuously?
Well, no, I think all boys at preparatory schools enjoy games, however bad they are at them. I think we were rather zealous. Later on at Eton, we weren't so zealous. Then you peel away from the games lovers. But small boys, it's natural to them to play games.
Cyril, what did you talk to George about on these walks on the downs?
Well, I think a lot of the time we talked about the books we've been reading. And then there was our secret reading, which we enjoyed very much. We could talk about to each other.
What was that?
Well, those were the books that we weren't supposed to have, but which we managed to get hold of.
Such as?
Sinister Street was the classic case. And neither of us knew that Sinister Street referred to the hero being illegitimate, and so we couldn't understand why it was such a dreadful thing to have this book and why it was taken away immediately. Of course, he liked these very morbid stories about mysterious plagues and illnesses. He liked the Mask of the Red Death, and he liked Orwell's imaginative stories about people from other worlds causing epidemics and pestilences. And he liked these fearful morbid moral questions like, would you drink a pint of blood to save your father?
He was always a great admirer of Wells's early work, wasn't he? I seem to remember that he didn't like those sort of pretentious sociological books of Wells's.
I think he liked two things about Wells. He liked the sheer fantasy of the Country of the Blind and the War of the Worlds and the Island of Dr. Moreau and the Time Machine, I think he liked. And he also liked the delicious lower middle class, self-employed Mr. Polly kind of people.
Mr. Polly.
Yes, exactly. And that all through his life he loved that sort of person, didn't he? And he wanted to be one himself. He wanted to have his little shop and his eccentric opinions and be one of these English characters in the way in which Polly and Mr. Kipps were. Another thing about these walks was that they really took you back into the old-fashioned England of before the First War and into these little villages like Jevington and West Dean and East Dean where we used to go. And in each of them there would be this little village shop where we would be very hot having walked all the morning on a day like this to get there. And there in the shop would be these little paper cones of sherbet and these bottles of cherryade and cherry fizz, we called it, and the lemonade with the glass marble in the stoppers, and the old lady running it, who was in fact rather like somebody out of a Wells book. And I think Orwell liked all that very much.
Orwell left his preparatory school with relief. He says this about going to Eton: a public school with better than cross gates, but equally alien in a world where the prime necessities were money, titled relatives, tailor-made clothes, neatly brushed hair, a charming smile. Sunday walks in Windsor Great Park provided an escape.
How often did you manage to do it when you were at school?
I certainly remember doing one with him, especially because in the first 2 years I was at Eton, contact between him and me was rather inhibited by him being a year senior.
Yes.
And we were almost untouchables to each other.
But up here you could do it.
Well, on this walk we could talk about anything we liked, yes.
George III.
Quite.
He was the king who went mad, wasn't he?
Yes, but he was very popular at Eton, and he was very kind to Eton boys always, and however mad he was, he'd always stop and say something to them.
Didn't he think he was pregnant at one point?
I don't know about that. Did he, really?
If someone had said to you in those days, what do you think of that boy Blair, what would you have answered?
he did have this great moral courage. I mean, no one could bully Orwell. He wasn't an athlete, but people respected him. They were a little bit frightened by him, and he wasn't beaten very much. Occasionally he was, but on the whole, people let him alone. And I remember one incident from my school days very vividly. At Eton, there was no bullying from top to bottom, but in the same year group, there would be bullies, especially among the little boys. They were often very fierce little boys who bullied the other little boys. Well, I had one or two people like that who used to bully me, and I remember once after prayers walking down the corridor in college past the various people's rooms, and in one of the rooms were some of these bullying people, and as I went by, rather like a terrible gangster film, a hand reached out and yanked me into this room, and there were the bullies, two of them, just like two killers from Chicago, and they said, "Connolly, what the hell do you mean by talking so much to boys in the election above? You're sucking up to them, and you know you spend all your time bleating poetry to Highlands." And so they then proceeded to start punishing me, you know, hitting me from one to the other. And I'd been with Orwell. He was walking just behind me, and he saw me disappear. And instead of walking on, as many sort of politic little boys would have done, he came in there. He opened the door, and when he came in, he saw the bigger of these two bullies, and he simply just went for him. He gave him one sort of terrific punch, and then yanked me out again, and then we resumed our walk down the corridor, still talking about
That's very nice.
Samuel Butler.
Do you think he had much a sense of humour? I mean, did he laugh much at school?
Oh, constantly, yes. He was always laughing and arguing and barracking and quibbling with people and heckling.
Yes.
And he seemed, like Socrates, to be constantly questioning everybody and everything they did or said, and always with this wheezy laughter. You think that, but by God, I don't think you'd think it in 10 years' time, or if you hadn't got this or that, etc. He was a debunker before the word existed.
And a great dismisser of people and things, wasn't he? The broad gesture.
Yes,
I mean,
very
you know, there
sweeping.
won't be any
yes,
Ascot.
yes.
I mean,
No, no.
you know, in
Yes,
2 years' time.
2 years' time, there won't be any Ascot.
Yes.
No, it'll be a Chinese Ascot.
Yes,
Yes,
or something like that. It's an extraordinary statement, which I don't know whether he said it to be funny or whether he really believed it. What do you think of his works? Do they give you pleasure to
Oh,
read
yes, yes, very much so. The only big qualification I would make was I don't really think he was a very good novelist. The books of his I like best are the sociological ones where he puts himself in as the narrator, like The Road to Wigan Pier and Homage to Catalonia, and Done Out in London and Paris, you know. That's a very remarkable book in its way, too. It was his first book.
How about your writing aspirations?
Well, I don't know what Orwell was writing at Eton. He didn't show me things any longer. And I continued to write rather dreadful poetry. But when we were at our first school, we did start, both of us, to write poetry, and we did show it to each other. And I've got a letter, I think it must be the first known Orwell manuscript that there is, which is his criticism of a piece of poetry of mine.
What was the subject of your poem?
The Death of Lord Kitchener.
Good God.
So that takes you back to 1916. But this is what I luckily found this letter to my mother. And this is how I describe him in the letter.
Terribly interesting.
I played in a match yesterday. I made 4. I've not got mumps yet. I enclose a poem I made up about Lord Kitchener a few nights ago. I got the chap who is considered the best poet to criticize it, which he did on the other side. He did a very good poem, which he sent to a local paper, where they took it. I know it's pretty putrid stuff, but you won't mind so much as I made it up. The first being, then I go on about describing the poem being in blank verse and so on. Well, now here we come to the end of the poem, where I write, "Stern criticism, please." Dear sir, I think your poem is. And then this is written in Orwell's very, very adult handwriting, quite different from most schoolboys.
It is indeed, yes. Yes.
Dashed good, dashed is underlined, slight repetition, scansion excellent, meaning a little ambiguous in places, epithets for the most part well selected. The whole thing is neat, elegant, and polished. E.A. Blair.
It's wonderful. I like it very much. When you went to Spain, I remember reading your articles when you were there, and did you run across Orwell in Spain?
No, I don't think I ever did. I met his wife in Barcelona where she was working, but I never got... he was in a very obscure part of the Aragon front, and you had a great deal of trouble getting through the anarchists to get anywhere near it. I got up as far as Fraga, and he was still about 30 or 40 miles beyond that in the mountains of Alcubierre.
What do you think of the Homage to Catalonia?
Oh, I think it's a very, very good book, but again, I think it's slightly weakened by having so much politics in, so much accounts of political phases and articles from newspapers, as it were. It's not enough of pure Orwell in it. You see, I think his greatness as a writer is that he's rather like Lawrence, a person who, the moment he himself is talking in his books, you feel his presence completely there. I mean, he's absolutely this strange, gentle, critical, cynical personality comes out completely in the way he writes as in the way he talks. And this pessimism of his, I think, is peculiar to him. And I'd like to say that this I noticed always in him as a boy, too. It's a bracing pessimism, a feeling that once you admit the worst, everything's a bit more fun all round. And therefore you almost seek out the worst in order to have that pleasure of saying, well, it looks as if it's our party now, all the others have left us. And
it'd be absolutely idle to pretend that he took a particularly sunny view of anything. But it may have been partly to do with his illness, of course.
Yes, but before the illness weakened him too much, as with Lawrence, there was a sunniness in the pessimism.
Avril Dunn must be ahead of us up there, I suppose, where George's house was.
Yes, but you can't see it until you get round the promontory.
Your brother, he was an extraordinarily reticent chap about himself.
Yes.
Both in his writings and in conversation. One's never really had any picture of him as a little boy at home. What was he like?
Well, of course, in a way it's a difficult question for me, Malcolm, because he was a good deal older than me, so I don't remember him as a very little boy. But what I do remember when he was about, 15, 16, he was, I should think, completely normal in a sort of way. He was fond of shooting and fishing. I think the shooting was more for the pleasure of the shooting, because I remember at one time he and some friends, they shot a red squirrel, which of course is a rather rare animal, and he was really desperately sorry that he'd actually shot this lovely creature. But the actual chase and hunt was the thing that he liked. And fishing, he was always very keen on fishing, loved it. Otherwise, he never showed any sort of particular literary talent.
Did he write things when he was a
Well,
kid?
he said he did, but you know, I never saw him writing anything, and I don't think we ever saw anything that he did write.
Did he read a lot?
Yes, he was always a reader. We were all readers.
Do you remember who his favourite authors were as a kid?
Well, he very much liked, always, P.G. Wodehouse. And, let me see, who else was there? Oh, he liked sort of Rider Haggard and the usual run of them.
Adventure books.
Adventure books, yes. But he never liked a sort of straight novel, you know, a love story. It never seemed to interest him at all.
I suppose your family was sort of rather poor than rich. I mean...
Well, the thing is that my father spent, as you know, about 30 years out in the East, and he retired, I think, when he was about 50, which sounds very early these days, and he retired on a pension of about 400 a year, which sounds a complete pittance now. But in those days, you know, it went quite a long way. And we always seemed to live quite comfortably. My mother, in about 1930, I think, inherited a little money from her parents, who were then dead. And she bought the house which we lived in Southwold, Montague House. So actually we didn't have any rent to pay. And we seemed to live very comfortably. She was a good manager.
She, I suppose, really was better known to you all than your father.
Yes. She was much more of a personality than my father. My father was always rather withdrawn and vague, rather in the same way that Eric was in a way, but of course not such a clever man.
Did he serve in a bookshop for a time, didn't
I
he?
believe he did, yes. I really know very little about that period of his life. But,
Met the man who kept the shop. He gave a very droll account of George as an assistant in a bookshop, forgetting the prices of all
I'm
the books
sure.
and
But
hunting.
being too vague for words.
Yeah.
Probably reading all the stock, instead of selling it.
That's absolutely all the books that he didn't like, so throwing them away.
Yes, or
There's
recommending them people not to read them,
not to read.
possibly.
No, whatever you do, don't read them. But then they had this village shop, didn't they?
They had a village shop when he was first married. I don't honestly know whether he would ever intended running it properly as a village shop, because they did take over a certain amount of stock with the shop. But by that time, the grocery vans had invaded the village, and the inhabitants of the village had transferred their patronage to the grocery van, and really there was no need for a shop. And I think all they did was simply sell off the stock. And I think in very bad weather, when they got snowed up, possibly eat it.
Or drink it.
Or drink it.
Were you very surprised when he came and settled in this wild place here?
Well, I wasn't really, because after all, he'd been living in London all during the war. It was kind of strange. And he always loved the country. And here, you see, he was completely free and away from everybody. Nobody could get at him. Difficult communications altogether. And I think that was one of the reasons why he came. And it is a lovely place.
Living here must have been the most difficult operation, I should think.
Well, you had to be self-reliant and able to do things yourself, because, of course, you never could get a tradesman up to do anything if you broke a window or a pipe burst.
And I suppose any question of getting a doctor would have been tried out of the question.
Well, there was a doctor on the island, but, of course, right down at the other end, and nobody was very keen to come up because the road was so bad.
Good God, look at that ram.
Yes, well, we get rather used to seeing dead sheep in this part of the world.
Yeah, it found life somewhat hard.
Do you think that he felt that he was writing against time, as it were?
I don't think so, because I don't think that he was the sort of person who ever thought he was going to die. Not immediately, anyway.
Although he knew he was ill, of course.
He knew he was ill, but I don't think he ever entertained what is commonly known as the death wish.
Which was George's room, actually?
Well, that he wrote 1984 in
Where he's working.
Where he's working.
Yes.
Well, when he was ill, which of course was quite often, he worked in the extreme left-hand top room. You can see the window from here. And at other times, when he was feeling well, he worked in the sitting room, which was the extreme right-hand bottom window.
This extraordinary thing that crops up all through his writing, his fiction and his writings about himself, that he was conscious of being unattractive, which he sometimes carried to the most extraordinary lengths of saying, I smelt.
Well, I know.
But what was that? Why was this? Because it was complete nonsense. Well, I mean, he was a very attractive chap.
Well, I think it was
him.
a sort of inferiority complex somehow, because it was obviously untrue, wasn't it? He wasn't. He wasn't unattractive in any way.
He wasn't a sort of.
And as far as smelling goes, I mean, he was a sort of cleanse maniac. He was always washing and putting on clean clothes, and had a sort of mania about being clean personally.
Do you think that if he'd been properly looked after, or properly looked after himself, his life might have been saved?
Well,
back?
I think when you say look after himself, I think that's a very cogent point, because he was in Haremeier's Hospital, as you know, for about 6 months, and they really did him an awful lot of good. And I think if he'd looked after himself properly when he came out of there, that probably he'd be alive today.
Orwell wrote some of his best essays for Cyril Connolly's magazine Horizon. His first wife had died at the end of the war. Through his contact with Horizon, he met and married Sonia Brownell. Sonia, I remember once discussing with you the end of 1984, and it was very interesting what you said, that, I mean, the general idea is that it has an unhappy ending because George was sick.
Yes, well, that's wrong, isn't
right.
it?
Now,
yes.
you explain that, because I was very interested in what you said.
Well, it seems to me, what George said to me was that if he, I mean, people want 1984, if they want a 1984, to end in a different way, it means they have missed the point of the book, it seems to me, because it's the working out of an idea which must be ineluctable. It just must go on in that way.
It must end tragically.
Oh, it must end tragically, because otherwise the power wouldn't be complete, would it?
Correct.
And if there was a spark left in that two people loving each other could defeat a totalitarian system,
Then there's no
well, then
book.
we'd be back to love is all and love saves all, and that's... But, I mean, since that is a book with the most incredibly subtle working out of an idea, the story couldn't have changed. But this is where his preoccupation with style comes in. He did once say that had he felt a bit better, he would have written the end better. Not changed the end,
Has
just
been
made
rewritten it or written it in the first place better?
rewritten it
It's a
better.
very interesting point, and I absolutely agree with you, and I think it's a point that needs to be made. The idea of giving 1984 a happy ending, which was done in the film, wasn't it, one of the
Oh,
films?
yes, but that was absolutely
Completely fatuous.
crackers, yes.
Completely
And,
fatuous.
the producer said, I know it's got an unhappy ending, but I have belief in human nature. And I was so cross, I said, well, your belief does you credit, but you simply missed the point.
Absolutely right. What do you think of Berman's days, Sonia?
Utterly touching and utterly sad,
It
isn't
is. And you're absolutely no relation to the British Raj or anything like that.
It's got a very big relation to British Raj.
Come
Well,
on,
I don't
I love
know.
being contradicted.
Well, simply that I had an aunt in Burma, and she said that every single person was taken from life,
Yeah.
and she knew them all.
But I still can tell you, I was living in India at exactly the same time, you know.
Were you?
Yes, just the same years. And the thing is that it's
Well,
like...
what were you doing there,
I was
Malcolm?
teaching at college.
Oh, well, that's very different. You were an intellectual then.
I
And
was
George wasn't.
intellectual. I was teaching at a college, but all I say is that I knew that world of the small
Yes.
up-country station.
Yes.
And in a sense, I can quite see what your aunt meant, that they were...
But don't forget, I
real
was
people.
born in India.
Yes, I know you were.
And my mother and aunts were just like that.
I know, but I'm not criticising your
Yes.
aunt, darling. I'm only saying your aunt, I understand what she meant, but
Yes.
I still say that it was a sort of dream version of Europeans, because the Europeans all had to say the things that they were supposed to say to fit in with a certain view of the
But
British
that's
Raj.
made
But
clear in the book.
though he was a relatively successful writer, he still found it very hard to earn a living.
Well, Animal Farm is a breakthrough. I think up
Yes.
to Animal Farm, a good week would have been anything that made £5 clear. And then Animal Farm's the Book of the Month Club in America. And then it was typical of George's luck that they sent a cheque for £10,000 and the tax took £7,000. And that was when they started fighting the case of spreading the writer's earnings. But from that moment, in paperbacks, really, that's where a person like George would make money now.
Do you think the young are interested in him now?
I've been amazed by some very affluent young men, it seems to me, who identify themselves with the Orwell character saying, keep the aspidistra flying. And how they do this, I don't know, but I suppose it describes any young man's struggle to get some money and keep his integrity, if this is possible.
Climbing up onto a pier, it's rather like climbing into a little country or even cosmos. It's a very Orwellian world, very shut off from the surrounding country. Yes, I can very well see him stalking along here, looking neither to right nor to left, not really noticing any of the people sitting around, but not prevented by that from developing strong theories about them and what they were thinking and what they were hoping. They were looking forward to one of his prime occupations. These were the picture postcards that Orwell was so enormously interested in, about which he's written a long, fascinating essay. They were all done by a man called McGill. They appealed to him, I think, partly because they were very old-fashioned, and he liked
past better than the present. I think this sort of humour did actually appeal to him. Do people buy them now, ever?
Oh, yes. Many people buy them, but it's mostly the elder people that buy them today.
Young people don't like them.
No, they buy them, few, but not many.
That would have disappointed Orwell. He, of course, was very interested in those boys' magazines, the Gem and the Magnum, things like that. But they don't appear anymore.
Oh, no. They were before our time.
You've never had, you must be very...
No, we've never had them. No, we've never had them.
Oh, no. And kids, they buy, what do they buy?
Comics, these American comics and the Beatles books.
These American comics, are they? Yes. But they also, you have to have a lot of sex in it now, don't you?
No, this is the detective books. They just put the covers. There's nothing much in the books. It's just the covers.
But the covers attract the interest.
Yes.
Then when you read them, it's about something quite different.
People get very disappointed when they buy them.
They come and ask their money back.
Oh, no. Oh, no. No.
The love themes in Orwell's novels are, by contemporary standards, rather sentimental. His characters are preoccupied with poverty, rather than, as in J.H. Lawrence's novels, with their sexual urges. Partly because the one seemed to him to preclude the other, and partly because of his native prudery.
These magic domes suggest the road to Mandalay. As Orwell told me on one occasion, he considered to be about the best poem in the English language. He was, of course, enormously interested in India. In fact, in the war years, he worked in what he called the Ministry of Truth, which is actually the overseas service of the BBC, broadcasting lectures and talks to India with a view to stimulating their martial ardor on our side. I question rather whether it had the desired effect. It used to rather amuse me to see the old boy engaged in this somewhat forlorn enterprise. A curious thing about Orwell was his mania about shooting. Firearms fascinated him. It's strange in a way that someone so gentle as Orwell, so reluctant to hurt anybody, let alone take their lives, whether human being or animal, should have had this passion which went on at the end of his life. In the Spanish Civil War, he only fired his gun once. And then on another occasion, when there was street fighting in Barcelona, he actually managed to organize a sort of armistice so that people temporarily stopped firing. This fascination for weapons and shooting finds expression in his books. His account of shooting an elephant is a really wonderfully exciting description, though there again he muffed the final shot. Orwell, of course, deplored imperialist attitudes, yet he was, in his way, a great patriot with a particular love of England. The imperial responsibilities of Britain were already being shed in his lifetime. The first big step was taken, the independence of India, which he theoretically highly approved of, but actually perhaps had certain somber thoughts. Orwell lived to see the sun beginning to set on the empire on which, in theory, it never set.
The nightmare of 1984 has moved on from the deliberate horror Orwell envisaged to an aimless, vacuous one. A pin table rather than a rack. Numbers inanely registering. Orwell imagined an all-pervading dictatorship, seeking power for its own sake alone. He failed to foresee a moral, mental, and spiritual vacuity which made such a dictatorship unnecessary. Unanimity, as it's turned out, can be more effectively induced by indifference than by chicanery and terror. What need for newspeak when there's nothing to say, or for doublethink when no one is thinking anymore?